Well, good evening once again. Sometimes it's hard to pick which verses you're going to do when you're only limited to 3 because of the way we're doing service. But I do have a kind of a minor announcement to give you. This coming Lord's Day, we're going to have live music. We're going to have Gabriel here playing the piano, and so we can have as many verses as we want. If you would open your Bibles to Mark chapter 7, we'll be looking at verses 31 to 37. Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37. Some of you might have gotten the notes and printed them out. That's good. The story I want to relate to you in my intro is one that I actually know pretty well. However, it's been almost 30 years since I've heard it, and I heard it many times for a 2 or 3 year period when I was a young teenager. It is the conversion of the man who first introduced me to the Lord, Pastor Len Johnson. But I did call or contact his son, who is a friend of mine, and he gave me a few extra pieces of information that I did not have or had forgotten. But it's an amazing story. Pastor Len Johnson of the Community Bible Church in Eagle River has a remarkable testimony. He's went on with the Lord in '94, but he grew up somewhere in Chicagoland. And the story was he was saved during some revival meetings that were organized by a soup kitchen of the day. They were big tent revival meetings in Chicagoland, over 1,000 in attendance. And he had went forward in an invitation style, okay? But he had prayed. And a man came over to him and said, "Do you believe that God had saved you?" And he nodded his head. And the man put his arm around him and said, "Well, if you really believe, then tell them." Now, there was about 200 or 300 people left in this particular moment. But you got to understand something about Pastor Len. At that time, he was a young man, was no pastor, and he stuttered, he stammered, he could not speak, and he was shy. But this man told him to tell them. Why? Because confession is what we're to do, right? And so he just began to say, "I thank the Lord that he saved," and he stopped, realizing that he said it without any stutter. And then he continued, he said, "and healed me right now." And he went home and he read his Bible cover to cover. He said, "If I can find this in the Bible, I'll tell it to my dying breath." And he did exactly that. His emphasis was always on the salvation, and the healing or fixing of his voice was a side note. R.C. Sproul once said, "We get into the kingdom not because we walk down an aisle or sign a card, but because there is true faith in our hearts." And what you're going to see in this miracle is faith. You'll see faith born right before your very eyes. The healing of this deaf man illustrates the need that the gospel be preached with words in an arresting fashion. So let's read this passage, Mark 7, verses 31 to 37. Again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, within the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty. And they implored him to lay his hand on them. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers in his ears. And after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." And his ears were opened. Computers get really annoying. So sorry. His ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." So the first thing we're going to do is examine this event. Verse 31 tells us the geography where Jesus is and how far he's traveled. As the crow flies, it's probably 20 or 30 miles from where he was before in Syria. But it's actually something like 50 to 60 miles by feet. So a trip of possibly even a week. The area known as Decapolis is an area all to the east of the Jordan. It's 10 cities. Jesus has been here before. You might remember the account where he cast out a legion of demons from a man into a large herd of pigs. Remember the gracious response of the people after that? It wasn't so gracious, was it? In Mark chapter 5, verses 17, the demoniac who had the demons cast from him, he wanted to go with Jesus, but Jesus did not permit him, it says. But he said, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. So we've got some fame now, and Jesus is returning, and they remember this. In the timeline of events, it's less than a year until the Lord goes to the cross. Verse 32, we read that they brought him a deaf man who could not easily speak. Now think about that for a moment. This deaf man was not seeking Christ. His friends sought out Christ for him. Look at verse 32. We read explicitly that they implored Christ to lay his hands on them. Twice we read specifically that they were the instruments of this deaf man's appearance before Christ. Specifically that they implored or begged, or you might even say were begging continuously to heal this man. Now, verses 33 and 34 give us the particulars of this healing. I want to note for you that there was a crowd. Here's the place, and the only place we see in this account that there was a crowd, but we know there were crowds all around. But here, we're told that Jesus took him away from the crowd. We're not told where or how this was accomplished, but I'll note for you that many times Jesus healed without being in a crowd. He did things that were not publicly seen by all. Just think about the previous message, the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. By all accounts, we don't even know that Jesus ever saw that girl. It was all about the woman speaking to Christ, right? There were some notable healing acts which were done publicly, such as the man with the withered hand, stretch forth your hand, boom. Or the paralytic who was lowered down from the roof by his four friends. But one thing you're going to find in the ministry of Christ, especially regarding healing, you'll never see anything that's formulaic. You'll never see any particular manner that he always healed. He didn't have some incantation, right? That's key to understanding how his ministry was. It's even like a deliberate attempt by Christ not to heal in any manner that is regulated or established or understood. And we got this man who is deaf. He cannot readily speak, and he's brought to Christ. Now the man doesn't even know who Christ is. I don't think there's any way he could have known. He came to Christ by virtue of his friends. They brought him. One wonders what this man thought. But unless you've got a deaf person in your immediate family, we probably don't understand the way they think. It's not easy to communicate with deaf people, is it? Maybe some of us have seen some sign language. Of course, we've seen signers in different venues here and there. And maybe some of you have picked up a few signs and you might know how to sign certain words, right? Let's consider, though, how deafness really is if we compare it with another known disability, blindness. Have you ever wondered, would it be something that, if you were forced to be either blind or deaf, if you had some horrible choice before you and you had to pick, which one would you do? And of course, the first thing you think is, well, certainly I'd rather be deaf, because we love our eyesight. We can't lose our sight. But think about what that really means. Sometimes, having thought about things in my childhood and so on, I've thought, well, even though I'd hate to lose my eyes, I think I'd rather be blind than deaf. Let me explain why. My father is nearly deaf. In fact, the first 20 or 21 years of his life, he couldn't hear anything unless it was yelled really loudly at him. He never knew birds could sing. In 61 or 62, when he got his hearing aids, that's the first time he heard birds sing. He knew about it because people told him, but he didn't know that. Contrast that to a friend of my father's who I met from the age 6 up, Bob. Now, Bob was normal when I first met him as a young boy. He could see, he was normal, he worked with my dad in the hospital, but he had glaucoma. And in those days, at the certain point, you could not do anything with glaucoma, so they had to remove his eyes for the pain. So by the time I was 10, Bob was blind. But Bob was a character, and he was always teasing me as a young little boy, saying that he would take his eye out and he'd literally pop out a glass eye, and it was kind of whoa. And he would tell me other jokes and tease me about this or that, and it's kind of funny thinking about it today. I knew this much about Bob. No matter what I thought of him, I was never going to pull something over on him. I could not sneak around him. The man would pull money out and ask me, what bill is it? And I'd think, oh, he doesn't know. And I'd tell him something different. Nope, he knew exactly what bill it was, and he'd call me on it every time. So there was always a way. He was knowledgeable. Now, you compare that with the way people treated my father growing up, and you think about it. Deafness and dumbness go together typically. And what is the connotation of the word dumb? We know it's supposed to mean that you can't speak. But it also has a general meaning that is often associated to it that, they're not that bright. Well, the reason is the communication is not there. It's hard to communicate when you can't hear. But here, this is our deaf man. Was he really stupid? Not that we know of. He knew nothing, though, of Christ, this miracle worker, this teacher who was traveling around. You did have to hear of Christ. And even though the former demoniac had been spreading the word, this man wouldn't have understood anything. So let's consider some of the event of what happened. What did Christ actually do when he healed this man? Well, he did this. He put his fingers in the man's ears. And looking at the language, and some of the commentaries actually make it sound like he literally jammed his fingers in the man's ears. He just got the man's attention. He spit. He touched the man's tongue. And there's some question as exactly what happened there, but the best understanding I was able to read is he spit on his fingers and touched the man's tongue with his spit. Then it says he looked up to heaven, he sighed, and he said, "Be opened," to the man in Aramaic. That's what ephatha is. It's an Aramaic word for be opened. 6 specific actions. All this theatrics, someone might say. Well, we know this much for certain. Christ didn't have to do any of these things to heal the man, right? We know that from past healings, where he just said, your daughter is healed, or stretch out your hand. But why did he do that with this man? The answer is found in my thesis, which I already stated. The healing of this deaf man illustrates the need for the gospel to be preached with words in an arresting fashion. And the last couple of verses, 35 to 37, give us the results and the responses of the various parties at the end of the message. But our chief task is to consider the reason for Christ's theatrics and just answer the question, how is what Christ did when healing this man faith building? Now, back about a year and a half ago, 2 years almost now, I guess it was, in 2018, I preached a message about faith and Abraham. And I'm going to kind of look at some of those points briefly again in a question and answer format. So I've got a couple of questions. What is faith? Well, faith is a gift of God. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Faith is defined in Hebrews 11:1. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is a disposition toward God. And here's a bit of new information, something I didn't say in that message. There can be impediments to faith. And we see that in today's account. How is faith exercised? To have true faith is to believe that which God has asserted. Is there counterfeit faith? Absolutely. We can have, we read of temporary faith, we read of an evil heart of unbelief, which, to be truthful, all men have in depravity by nature. What are the elements of faith? Assurance, trust, commitment, right? Faith makes you call upon God. And the three elements that are key here, it includes the intellect, but it is not mental assent only. So it includes the mind. It includes the heart, to you who believe he is precious. And it includes the will. Faith acts on the assurance received. But what was this man's dilemma? Let me read a verse from Romans, and you might say, that was the one I was thinking of, Pastor Cox. Romans 10, verses 14 and 15. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him in whom they have not heard? How will they hear without a preacher? How will they preach unless they be sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. His dilemma is that he did not know the gospel. And his problem is he could never know the gospel. He was deaf. The man's dilemma physically is the same dilemma that we all have spiritually. As dead men, we cannot hear nor know the gospel. We're essentially hopeless, helpless apart from Christ. I want to show you once again how this man's physical condition was a word picture for us of the spiritual condition of all men. Most of you remember the call, "Here I am, send me." It's that famous missionary call, right? It's found in Isaiah's call to ministry. I want to read just a couple of verses there. Isaiah 6, 8 through 13. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" Then he said, "Here am I. Send me." And he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on listening, but do not perceive. Keep on looking, but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, their eyes dim. Otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and return and be healed." Right? Isaiah continues, but I'm going to move on. The healing of this deaf man illustrates the need that the gospel be preached with words in an arresting fashion. Now consider these verses here. Isaiah 35. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. And of course, we know the account in Exodus 4, where Moses is kind of debating and arguing about God, or arguing with God about his commission to go and speak to Pharaoh. And the Lord said to him, "Who's made man's mouth? And who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" See, Moses didn't have a leg to stand on, did he? The Lord told him to go. And so he did. But not without a little arguing, right? Job 33:16. Then he opens the ears of men and seals their instruction. Proverbs 20:12. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made both of them. And then two more verses here. Zechariah 7:11. But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears from hearing. And of course, everyone remembers that message that Stephen preached and what he said at the end of the message. "You men are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart, and your ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did." So Jesus, he takes this man to the side, away from the crowd, a man who doesn't understand who he is or why his friends brought him to him, but he quickly begins to understand because Jesus sticks his fingers in the man's ears. This was no special incantation, right? It was to get his attention. It was to help him see where this encounter was going. It was to build faith in the man. He spits on his fingers and touches the man's tongue, not because his spit is anything, and not to be gross, but to illustrate to the man, I can speak, you will now speak. To give him faith to understand. God ordains that the gospel be preached. There's two passages that tell us this. 1 Corinthians 2, 6 through 10. Yet we do speak wisdom among those who are mature. A wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age, who are passing away. But we speak God's wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God predestined before the ages to our glory, the wisdom which none of the rulers of this age had understood. For if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But just as it is written, things which eye have not seen, and ear has not heard, and which have not entered into the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love him. For to us, God revealed them through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God. And also we have Romans 10, 16 and 17. However, they did not all heed the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So what does Christ do? He gets the man's attention, then he puts his face towards heaven and groans. Think about that. Where else do we read about somebody who's groaning towards heaven? We read about it in Romans. The Spirit himself bears with our spirit, with groanings when we have words that are too deep to be uttered. But then Jesus utters a word. And the first word he speaks in Aramaic, Because this man, that would be his native language. And it would be the first word he would hear. Ephphatha, be opened. You see, the healing of this man illustrates the gospel be preached with words in a resting fashion. Now, what does that mean for you and me? Several years ago, we had a guest preacher here who preached from the same passage. And I'm not going to remember, honestly don't remember much of that message. I just remember feeling like it was had an ill feeling to it. I didn't understand the direction he went, and it was a difficult message. Sometimes we read a passage the first time and we don't gain the understanding that we ought. Sometimes we can hear the word preached and not grasp the message the first time. Never let the enigmatic quality of a passage dissuade you from studying to show yourself approved. Let me leave you with just these 3 simple points, ideas, okay? The miracles which Christ did were purposeful, but not formulaic. You will not see Christ performing similar incantations or special hocus pocus to flaunt power. You see, Christ's power was not derivative, but direct. This same Christ, who is himself the power of God, was willing to do what looks crazy and staged in order to work faith out in a person who needs it. Christ will go to the nth degree to save a man. He stoops to the lowest, and he stoops even for you. Which, of course, begs the question, how much will you do to reach a man? Lastly, the message of this healing being done in such an unusual manner does point to the gospel. The gospel is indeed preached, and once heard, creates faith in those he loves and who seek him. The healing of this deaf man illustrates the need that the gospel be preached with words in an arresting fashion. What are you doing to spread the word? Amen.